The original story from which Disney reimagined into Sleeping Beauty is one that is not for the faint of heart. It's a story that was called The Sun, the Moon, and Talia, and is actually a lot more like a horror story that, should it ever be turned into a film, would easily land itself an R rating. The Italian poet from the 1600s named Giambattista Basile made the story popular in 1634 when it was released as a part of his collection of fairy tales called Pentamerone. This is the same collection that contains what are known to be the first versions of Rapunzel and Cinderella. It even contained a story that was also altered into Puss in Boots. Though there have been many different versions of The Sun, the Moon, and Talia spread throughout history, Basile's version was the very first. As a matter of fact, his tales are often compared to those from the Brothers Grimm, with many people claiming him to be the best storyteller of his time. And seeing how influential he and his stories were in inspiring the fairy tales we all know and love today, we think it's important for you to hear a brief retelling of what The Sun, the Moon, and Talia was actually about. Be warned, this story, as we said, is not for the faint of heart, and it takes a very twisted and unexpected turn in the middle, so please either skip ahead to that part or avoid it altogether if you don't want your childhood ruined forever. It all started with a child, a baby girl who was given the name Talia. She was a child born of a powerful king, and as such, she was treated like royalty, which during the time meant being blessed and being presented to many powerful figures throughout the kingdom, such as prophecy-telling wise men. And when Talia's father had her prophecy told, he learned of something horrible. It was said that in one way or another, the child was to die after being struck by a flax splinter. And during that time, flax was a very important plant fiber that was often found in biblical stories. It was used in a lot of different things that would be found around the kingdom, including linen and other fibrous material. After hearing this news, Talia's father knew that he had two options in front of him, one of which would include him having a very sensible conversation with his child about the situation, and the other would allow him to keep the information to himself. You see, he could either inform his daughter of the impending danger should she have contact with a flax splinter, or let her know not to wear any clothes made out of flax and other things like that. Or he could have his men remove everything within the palace that was made out of flax or hemp. That way, not only would he be able to keep Talia safe from death, but he would also not have to talk to her. And of course, Father of the Year went with option B and had all the items that were made from flax removed from the palace. So Talia grew up in a world where her fate was written, but she was the only one who wasn't allowed to know about it. It was also a world where she had no idea what flax was, even though it was something that was ever present in the world around her. But as long as she stayed within the palace walls, she was theoretically safe from it and any splinters it might come with. Fast forward a few years, and Talia was a bit older and had, for the most part, listened to her father and stayed within the walls of the palace. However, one day while she was looking out of her window, she saw something that she had never witnessed before. From her window, she could see an older woman spinning something on a spindle. Curiosity overtook Talia, and she decided to go and see for herself what was happening. So she left the palace and made her way over to the older woman, and once she got to her, she asked the lady what she was doing. The woman informed Talia that she was spinning flax, which is something that Talia had never seen or even heard of before. The older woman noticed Talia's curiosity toward the spindle and asked her if she would like to learn how to stretch flax, and Talia was elated by the request and agreed. And sure enough, she began spinning the flax and working it through the spindle with her hands, at which point the prophecy was fulfilled. As she was stretching the flax, a tiny splinter from the fiber lodged itself underneath Talia's fingernail, at which point Talia fainted and all signs of life faded from the young woman's body. Talia's father was heartbroken to find out that his daughter had seemed to die just as the wise man foretold. If only he could have done something more to keep her safe, like warn her about the dangers of flax or something. But alas, all that was left for him to do was to figure out what he would do with his daughter's corpse. I know, another tough decision, right? He could either A, bury his daughter as most people would with their dead child, or B, he could put her body in one of his palaces that he had apparently placed throughout the woods. Obviously, he's going to make the sensible choice again. So he dressed his daughter in the most expensive dress that she owned and had his men carry her body safely into the woods and to one of his hidden palaces. After his men placed her body neatly into the palace, they then locked it up and left it abandoned. And as far as this story goes, her father never came to the palace to visit his daughter's resting place. It's unclear how much time had passed, but sometime later, a different king was on a hunting trip in these woods. The king had a falcon with him to help him hunt, and it was one that he trusted greatly. However, at some point during the trip, his falcon flew flew away from him and into an open window high up on the wall of a palace that he had never seen before. He knew that he had to go and retrieve his hunting partner, so he walked up to the palace door and began trying to get the attention of whoever might be inside. But after a while of no one answering, the king decided that he would try a different tactic. He began scaling the wall, climbing up the side of the castle toward the open window that he saw his falcon fly into. Eventually, the king made it up to and inside the window. And honestly, up until this point, this story still seems like it could be the beginning of a Disney film. It's fairly family-friendly so far, but this is when things get weird, and that's telling it lightly. You see, once he entered the window, the king began to look around the estate and was surprised to find it to be mostly empty. And he was even more surprised when he found a woman who appeared to be in a deep sleep. This was, of course, Talia. And though her father believed her to be dead, she was, in fact, in a deep sleep-like state caused by the splinter that she got underneath her fingernail. This king didn't know about the splinter, though, so despite everything he tried to do, Talia wouldn't wake up. And here is when the supposedly valiant king becomes the creep of all creeps. I won't go into detail, however. I will say that he apparently fell so passionately in love with the seemingly dead woman that he brought her over to a nearby couch and did unspeakable things to her while she was unconscious. And then once he was done committing a crime that should have landed him on the executioner's block, he just left the tower and made his way back to his kingdom, all but forgetting about what he had just done. Oh, and did I mention that he had a queen? So not only did he commit a crime, he also committed adultery. Now, as we said, Talia was still alive, just in a very deep sleep-like state. And since the king who committed that awful act did not wear any sort of protection, Talia ended up getting impregnated by him. This would be a problem on account of the fact that Talia can't really do anything but lay around lifelessly. However, it's lucky for her that fairies of the forest took a liking to her and began to take care of her when she was left there by her father. These same fairies took care of Talia while she was pregnant and then continued to take care of the children after they were born. Not really sure how that process went down, but I guess it did. They would use Talia to feed the babies by holding the children in the proper position to feed naturally, though the entire situation was quite unnatural. And this is where Talia gets a brush of luck. Before feeding time one day, one of the children mistook Talia's finger for its original target, and the finger happened to be the one with a flax splinter underneath the nail. When the child sucked on her finger, it dislodged and removed the splinter, allowing her mother to finally wake up. Of course, when she woke up, she was quite confused. She had no recollection of her time sleeping in the tower, meaning she also didn't remember the king and what he did to her. Instead, all she knew was that she was a mother. Some time went by, and the king finally remembered about his last visit to his woodland secret and decided it was time to ride out there again in hopes of being disgusting once more. However, this time when he arrived at the estate in the woods, he found Talia to be awake and caring for children that he knew were his. Surprisingly enough, the king opened up to Talia and told her what he had done to her, and even more surprising, she not only forgave him, but apparently decided that she could love him. The king decided that the feeling was mutual and he wanted to live with her happily ever after. However, there was a small problem, which of course was the situation of his current wife. Once the king returned to his kingdom, the queen was immediately suspicious of his mood and where he had been. So she did the only sensible thing, right? Wrong. That's not a theme that we find in this story at all. Instead of asking the king what was going on, she decided to capture the king's secretary and make them tell her what the king was up to under the threat of death. And when she found out about her husband's affair, needless to say, she was not happy about it. So, under her orders, but in the name of the king, she sent the king's men to take the king's new children and bring them to her. She then gave them to the cook and told him to serve them as supper to the king. She was so evil that every time the king took a bite, she would say to him, "You are eating what is your own," to which he assumed that she was saying he paid for the food or owned the animals that made the food. So he replied by basically telling her that he knows because she hasn't brought him anything into their marriage or their home. Burn! The queen continued her terror by forcing the men once again in the name of the king to bring Talia to her, and they did without question. And when the two women finally met face to face, they did not share kind words. The queen was even prepared to have Talia burned alive in the courtyard. The only reason Talia survived is that she stalled by asking to strip before burning. This gave her enough time for the king to come out and see what was going on. He immediately ordered the queen to be executed along with his secretary for betraying him. He intended to kill the cook as well. However, it turns out that he didn't kill the children. He had a conscience and decided to just hide them from the queen. The king ended up paying him well for his deeds and got his children back to him. And now that the queen was gone, he and Talia could live together happily ever after, as if none of this insanity had ever happened to them. And that's the end of the original Sleeping Beauty. Holy cow! I know a lot of Disney movies are based on old tales that tend to be darker than the movies we've grown to know and love, but oh man, this one has got to be the darkest of them all. I mean, I'm really glad that I grew up with the stories from our generation because the tales they told back in that time period do not seem kid-friendly at all. I'm glad that Disney was able to make a version of the story that was rather lighthearted and something for us to look up to instead of the source material. But what do you guys think? How do you feel about the sun, the moon, and Talia? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. As for now, that's all, Disney fans. Let us know what video you'd like to see next in the comments, and like and subscribe for more magically packed videos.